The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A new exhibit at the Harbourfront Library in Nanaimo brings attention to the privatization of much of the land on southeastern Vancouver Island. Called the Great Vancouver Island Land Grab, it's about the granting of land in exchange for construction of the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway. In the 1880s, more than 800,000 hectares of land were given to the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Company as a way to help finance building a rail line on Vancouver Island. Later on in the program, we'll hear from Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group Chief Negotiator Robert Morales, who was featured in the exhibit's introductory video. The Great Vancouver Island Land Grab is a partnership between the Vancouver Island Local History Society and the Nanaimo Museum. It launched at the Harbourfront Library on Thursday, June 4th. After spending the summer on display at the library in Nanaimo, it's expected to travel to other communities around the island. I spoke with Kelly Black, president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society. What's maybe the core nugget of the story that you're hoping to communicate with people in this exhibit?
The core nugget, well, that would be that the Great Land Grab, or the E&N Railway Grant, was an event in the 1880s where land was privatized and given to the railway company, and it still impacts us today.
Talk to me about the name, the Great Land Grab, and this framing that you've settled on for the exhibit.
Well, the term the Great Land Grab actually comes from a publication by the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, which is a number of First Nations in the Cowichan-Chemainus region that put out this little sort of booklet about the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Grant of 1884-1887. And they titled that document The Great Land Grab. And they called it that because this event where almost 2 million acres of land was made private and handed over to the railway company, it impacts about 85% of their traditional territories. And so they were trying to get the word out back in about 2007. And so they put out this publication called The Great Land Grab to try and introduce people to it. And so with this exhibit, we are revisiting that title and trying to grab people's attention, if you will, with the title.
What specific details in this story do you think stand out in comparison to maybe other processes in other places that have led to lands being settled and that have impacted Indigenous people's access to what had been their traditional territories or lands?
Well, in 2026, we're talking about the largest contiguous piece of privately held land in British Columbia. So the sheer scale of it is one of the big differences. The other sort of big difference is that this is about 95% of British Columbia is Crown lands in the eyes of the Crown, the provincial and federal governments. But when you look at a map of Vancouver Island, it's much, much different. And that's because of the Great Land Grab, the E&N Railway Grant of the 1880s. And so by privatizing that land, it's had all kinds of implications. One of the main ones being that in the modern treaty process in British Columbia, nations cannot negotiate for private property, for privately held land. And when you have this event like the E&N Land Grant, you have, like the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, 85% of your traditional territory was given away at the stroke of a pen in the 1880s. So there's a question of, well, is this fair? Is this just? Should this be allowed to stand? And these are some of the things that the exhibit goes into.
How about the railway itself? How does that factor into this consideration of the land grant of close to 2 million acres?
Well, in the historical context, of course, the railway and the land grant are directly linked. In order to entice investors to form a company and build the railway, the provincial and federal governments in the 1880s said, we'll give you a whole pile of land, nearly 2 million acres. We'll give you $750,000. Plus, we'll give you the rights to the timber and most of the minerals. And in the context of 2026, what that really doesn't really have a connection to the railway, because the railway corridor was essentially spun off to the not-for-profit Island Corridor Foundation in 2006. And so that foundation, they own the corridor, but they don't have anything to do with the privately held lands. Now, there are many issues around the corridor. When the railway was built, sections of existing reserves were expropriated by the railway company to put the tracks through. And so there are issues with the corridor regarding land and access by and for First Nations. But the land grab itself and the lands that encompass these tracks is separate from the corridor itself.
If we're going back to the late 19th century, what is your sense of how this land grant was viewed by various parties from different sections of society?
Well, not everyone agreed that the land grant was a good thing. Even among settlers, some saw it as necessary to get the railway built. This was kind of the way things were done back then. The same thing happened with the Canadian Pacific Railway. When it was built across Canada, the CPR was given vast tracts of land along either side of the railway line. And that was, at the time, thinking would be, it's expensive to build a railway, so the company needs something extra in order to be enticed to do it. We'll give them land. And that was the same thinking in the 1880s on Vancouver Island as well. There had to be this inducement to construct the railway. And so some politicians were very much in favor and others were not. And even in the 1880s, people on Vancouver Island were saying, you're giving one company, the E&N Railway Company, a monopoly, and monopolies are not good. And you're giving away all this land, and that's not good. And in the years that followed, there were many court cases from settlers, from non-Indigenous peoples, basically opposed to the way that the E&N Railway Company and the province and Canada took the land. So it's complicated, and not everyone agreed that this is just how it's done. But certainly the people that were in power in the legislature in Victoria or the House of Commons in Ottawa, a majority of them did agree, and it did happen.
People will sometimes talk about the Douglas treaties from the 1850s. How do those play into the story of the E&N land grant?
Well, it depends which part of the land grant we're talking about. So, for example, there is a Vancouver Island Treaty or Douglas Treaty signed in Nanaimo in 1854. And so First Nations, the Nanaimo, and others in the Nanaimo region have an 1854 treaty. And that's way before the railway. But the history of British Columbia and recognition of treaties is a sordid one. And BC didn't recognize that treaty as being a treaty for well over 100 years after it was signed. And then in other parts of the land grab area, there were no Douglas or Vancouver Island treaties at all. And so that continues to be the case, that in most of the land grab area, there are no historical or modern treaties. And the land grab is a big barrier to the modern treaty process, as I sort of mentioned off the top. So In some places, the Vancouver Island or Douglas treaties may apply, but in other places they do not. And so this creates a really complex landscape with regards to First Nations rights and title, privately held lands, and crown lands on the eastern portion of Vancouver Island.
A significant chunk of this land these days is held by private forestry companies. I'm wondering if you can give me some context on that situation and what you feel people need to know about it.
Yeah, well, some historical context is that, the E&N Railway Company is given this land, and right away they start selling off large portions of it. And as we enter the 20th century, in the early 1900s, the railway companies start selling bigger chunks of land for forestry in particular. Then you get the Canadian Pacific Railway buying the E&N Railway Company in 1905, and then they start doing the same thing. And as we see the rise of industrial logging, think about blasting roads and logging trucks, then these tracts of land become more valuable because it's easier to access the timber that's there. And so in the 1950s, the CPR starts selling off even bigger portions of land to forestry companies. And then if you fast forward to the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, these lands and these companies are then spun off to big investment corporations like Brookfield Investment Corporation, for example. And now in 2026, pension plans, public pension plans, Canadian federal pension plan, provincial government pension plan, Canadian military pension plan, they are now the owners of these tracts of land because they bought up the companies that were the owners in the mid 2000s. So it's sort of a follow the money sort of a story. And so now, if you work for the provincial government, if you're a policy analyst in the Ministry of Environment, your pension plan is the part owner of the E&N land grab. They are the successors to it.
And what would you say are the consequences of that when it comes to trying to, I don't know, maybe do anything about the situation?
Well, a lot depends on who you are and how you're approaching it. So if you're First Nations from the land grab area, it impacts you in all kinds of ways. You have a loss of access to traditional territory for medicines, for monumental timber, for things like canoes and totems, loss of access to cultural sites to practice traditional cultural events. If you're non-Indigenous on Vancouver Island, it might impact you in any number of ways. Your retirement may be partially, betting on the land grab and the extraction of timber from the lands. You like to go mountain biking and you encounter those big steel gates when you go out, past Nanaimo lakes, let's say, or out past Shawnigan Lake. Or maybe you like to go mushroom picking and your favorite mushroom picking area has been gated off or logged off. So those are a couple of the ways that it impacts our lives on Vancouver Island. Another big way is real estate. So after the lands are logged over, some of the choice parcels then become real estate and are then sold by companies like Couverton Realty. And so then it becomes further removed from First Nations. And so maybe your house is built on land grab lands. If you look at your title, if you own property on the eastern portion of Vancouver Island, there's a very good chance that you will see the E&N Railway Company on that sheet of paper. So it impacts most of us in any number of ways.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
While the rail line along Vancouver Island has largely fallen out of use, the way its construction was financed is still reverberating through society today, says a new exhibit on display at Nanaimo's Harbourfront Library. The Great Vancouver Island Land Grab is a collaboration between the Vancouver Island Local History Society and the Nanaimo Museum. The exhibit is about the granting of hundreds of thousands of hectares of land to the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Company in exchange for the construction of a railroad on Vancouver Island. There was a launch event for the exhibit at the library on Thursday, June 4th. In attendance was Robert Morales, chief negotiator for the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. He spoke with me about how the land grant has impacted modern treaty negotiations.
Thalfit, my traditional name is Thalfit, Robert Morales. I am the chief negotiator for the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, which includes Cowichan, Penelakut, Halal, Laxon, and Lake Cowichan, Subasset.
And can you tell me about the launch of this exhibit here at the Harbourfront Library in Nanaimo? Maybe what are you hoping people take away from this exhibit?
Well, the history of the E&N Railway on Vancouver Island, I think, is really the major issue that has been acting as a major impediment in the treaty negotiations in this part of the world. When the governments of BC and the government of Canada granted away 2 million acres of land on Vancouver Island to a private, at that time, railway company, and issued a fee simple grant to all of that. That included all of the land, all of the timber, the trees, and all of the minerals. And then when we entered into the modern treaty process, the government said, well, those are considered private lands, and therefore we're not in a position to negotiate. So virtually by doing the E&N Railway Grant, the government of the day effectively removed 90% of the territory for the nations that I work with, Hul'qumi'num nations, off of the treaty table. So this is a really important issue for us to try and raise public awareness of the historical background.
How do all of the various historical pieces that are sometimes contradictory, things like, say, King George's royal proclamation in the 1700s or the 1850s Hudson's Bay Company Douglas treaties, and this land grant, how do they all kind of fit together and impact negotiations today?
Well, the English policy of the day is reflected in the Royal Proclamation. So, the direction was that you cannot take indigenous lands without some kind of a treaty or some kind of a compensation. That was the policy. And so you got, treaties all the way across Canada being negotiated. When you get to British Columbia, things change. And the colonial government started with James Douglas to negotiate some treaties. So you got the Douglas treaties. But then the policy and the attitudes really shifted. So then they started to assert that they didn't need to negotiate with the First Nations. First Nations, in fact, didn't have any rights to land, that the government, through their domestic legislation, had effectively extinguished all rights to land. So First Nations in British Columbia didn't have rights to land. That, of course, started to change once the Niska went to court and the Calder decision. Then the Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en went to court in the Delgamuukw decision. And then the Chilcotin Nations went to court in the Roger Williams decision. And then, of course, we have the latest one, which is the Cowichan decision, which has caused a lot of controversy. So each court has confirmed that, no, in fact, land rights for First Nations have not been extinguished. They continue to exist. So the biggest question right now is, and what I've been working on since I became the chief negotiator 26 years ago, is this issue of the E&N Land Grant. And what are the land rights of the nations in this part of the world on lands that have been, we say, taken without any compensation, without any treaties, without any discussion, and given away. And then the government comes back and says, "Oh, sorry, we can't do anything about it." That's the biggest challenge that we have in the work that we're doing.
I also spoke with the Vancouver Island Regional Library's Executive Director, Eileen Gillette, about having a history exhibit in the lobby of the Harbourfront Library. Why something like this at the library?
We're a public space and accessible. So the whole piece of having exhibits, and this is, I think, our fourth exhibit that we've had in the library, is the purpose for someone to come in and explore and learn more. And what a great place to learn and discover than the library, right? So you can come in, find the resource that you need, ask questions. But also, I think the key piece is it's accessible, right? And then also we bring people in who want to just see the exhibit and learn more about the library. So we've found having different experiences in the library makes it more dynamic and kind of maybe changes the traditional thinking about the library as well, because we really are here about exploring.
Earlier on the show, we were hearing from Kelly Black, president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society. Let's get you back to that conversation. Did you have any contact with, say, Mosaic or anyone representing the current landowners in the process of creating this exhibit about the land grant?
We did not, because they own the land and we know what they do with the land, and their position has been made very clear over the last couple of decades, which is that it's private land and therefore we manage it, and they say they manage it well. And it's up to the province and the government of Canada if there's going to be any solution to this problem. So their position they've made very clear over the years. So the point of this exhibit is to introduce people to this event and introduce people to the ways that they encounter the land grab, and not to present the position of the forest management company.
What do you view as a problem, or the problem that you feel like this exhibit is in part hoping to maybe address or start people down the path to a solution to?
Well, the point of the exhibit, as I've said, is to introduce people to it. Most folks probably have never heard of the E&N Railway Land Grant. Maybe they've heard of the E&N Railway, maybe they've walked along the E&N Rail Trail, or they drive over the tracks back and forth every day, to work or to school. But the land grab is one of these things that has kind of over time become not as visible to us. And we go about our lives not really knowing that 2 million acres of Vancouver Island was turned into private property. And so the point is to have people learn that this was a thing that happened and that it does impact us today. And then our hope is people will start talking about it and saying, what should we do? Should we do something about this? If so, what should we do? And those conversations are going to be really, really important to determining what kind of a future we want to see as pertains land use and the restitution of lands to First Nations on Vancouver Island.
What is the plan for the exhibit? As far as I know, it's going to be hanging out in the Harbourfront Library in Nanaimo for the first couple of months of the summer, and then maybe making its way to other libraries. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so the exhibit launched recently at the Nanaimo Harbourfront Library branch downtown, and it's going to be there until mid-August. People can go see it for free. Either just go in just to see it, the exhibit itself, or go in and get your pick up your holds and then check it out. Then it's going to tour through the library system a little bit, the Vancouver Island Regional Library System. It'll be going to the Cowichan Valley. It'll be going up island to, Qualicum, Campbell River, Courtney. And then hopefully it'll also be touring in other institutions, museums, universities, colleges, community centers on the island. We're still working on the full schedule, but it's available if people are listening to this and they're interested in booking it, maybe at their local museum or something. And so it's going to tour around so that we can get as many people seeing it as possible and as many conversations started as possible. And if folks are interested in the exhibit, but they can't see it just yet, or they want to know more about this issue, they can also view a virtual version of the exhibit at thegreatlandgrab.ca. And people will also find information about how to book the exhibit and what have you on that website as well.
When you first became aware of this land grant, what did that change for you in your life?
I grew up in Cobble Hill, looking at the railway, essentially, and looking at a logging operation, a logging maintenance yard. And so I knew the railway was a thing. I knew logging on Vancouver Island was a thing. But I'd never heard of the Great Land Grab or the E&N Railway Land Grant until I was taking an undergraduate course at VIU. And when I learned about the sheer size of it, I was quite taken aback. And then I also, I read that 2007 document, The Great Land Grab by the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. And I started to learn about how it's not just a historical event, but it really impacts us today, especially First Nations. And that kind of further threw me off. Like, what the heck? This is such a big deal. How come I'm born and raised here and no one ever mentioned it to me until I was in my mid-20s? And so I think that sort of surprise is something I've already seen. This exhibit's only been up for a few days, and I've already heard from people saying, I had no idea. And so I'm excited about what happens when we start to learn about why things are the way they are, because I've had that feeling firsthand, and I know that it can be maybe a surprising feeling, but it can also be an empowering one as well.
Beyond just an awareness of the issue, what are you hoping that people take away from going and seeing this exhibit?
I hope people take away a few things. I mean, the first is that the idea that private property is private property and it cannot ever change is not really true. This was not private property until the railway company took the land and was given the land. And private property is, we work at private property. Private property is based on relationships. And so this idea that it's inevitable, it's locked away, we can never do anything about it. I think when we look at history, it shows us that doesn't have to be the case. And so I think, yes, I hope people will know about it. I hope people will be moved to ask questions, for example, of politicians, of our elected leaders, and say, have you, Premier, MLA, heard of the Great Land Grab? What do you have to say about it? I also hope that people will just be motivated to understand the importance of learning our past in 2026. And I think combining public history and libraries can be very powerful. And I hope people see that our libraries are important and learning our past is important, and that they'll support learning about the Great Land Grab, but also future initiatives to interpret the past so we can better understand the present.
Well, private property has been the subject of headlines and hand-wringing a lot ever since the Cowichan decision. What would you say about that in the context of this exhibit, or releasing this exhibit in the context of that?
Well, the exhibit was underway well before the Cowichan decision came down. However, that court case took, well over a decade. And I think, this isn't an exhibit about court cases, but it is about understanding the current landscape in British Columbia regarding First Nations rights and title. And that situation has its roots in the history of British Columbia as a province within Canada, and it has its roots in the decisions that have been made by successive governments since the 1860s. Private property is never inevitable, and this situation where nations such as the Cowichan Nation or Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group nations, which includes Cowichan tribes, have to go to court to answer these questions is one that is created by the provincial and federal governments. And so this exhibit takes the example of the E&N Land Grant and says, this is how this came into being. We, as people living in British Columbia, we as the provincial government could do something about it. The exhibit does not prescribe what that is, but this idea that it's inevitable that private property is sacrosanct and therefore we must defend private property in the face of what we know about First Nations rights and titles on these lands, I think is something that people are asked to think about.
And I suppose there's the context of private property being someone's home and also private property being several thousands of acres of land owned by a forestry company, owned by a pension fund, which probably has some nuance to it.
Oh, correct. The Cowichan tribes and the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group are not saying private property being your home, we want to take your home. What they're saying is these lands, especially here on Vancouver Island, the context of the land grab lands, are forestry lands. They're not people's homes. And if 85% of their territory has been made private and they're not allowed to negotiate for private land, in this case, forestry lands, then how are they supposed to reach any kind of fair agreement for a treaty with the province of British Columbia and the federal government? And the answer is the government saying, no, you can't. So they have to go to court. And we get rulings like the Cowichan decision. So there's been plenty of discourse and, frankly, racism coming out of the Cowichan decision. And I hope if people spend some time with the history, they'll learn that there's a reason why we're in the situation that we're in. And there's no better time than right now to start learning that history and talking about it.
Kelly Black, thank you very much for taking the time to talk about it with me today.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Joe.
Kelly Black is president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society. The Great Vancouver Island Land Grab is on display at the Vancouver Island Regional Library's Nanaimo Harbourfront branch through the middle of August. After that, the plan is for the exhibit to make its way to other communities across Vancouver Island. More information can be found on the exhibit's webpage, greatlandgrab.ca. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. We'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.